Welcome everybody to the third session in our series. The session title for today is Why Do We Celebrate Lag BaOmer and How? It's part of the series From Sorrow to Joy, the Spring Holidays, which is a part of ScholarStream, a partnership with the conservative movement, giving communities the opportunity to learn from some of the world's leading scholars and engage deeply with our texts and traditions. Today's session will be taught by Rabbi Professor David Golinkin. He is the president of the Schechter Institute, Inc. in Jerusalem and a professor of Talmud and Jewish law at the Schechter Institute. He's the author or editor of 60 books and over 200 articles related to Jewish law and many other areas of Jewish study. We'll have time throughout the class today to answer some questions. You can send those to me via the chat. We won't have time to get to everyone's questions, but I'll do my best to pose people's questions to Rabbi Golinkin. So without further ado, I hand it off to Rabbi Golinkin.
Thank you, Max. Can you put everybody up on the screen together, or I need to do that?
You want?
I'd like a gallery view. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Hello, good evening from Jerusalem, or good afternoon, wherever you happen to be, or perhaps good morning. I see a few people that I know, such as Rabbi Ben Herman. Nice to see all of you. Our topic this evening is really three topics in one. The first question is, why do we mourn between Passover and Shavuot? The second question is, why do we celebrate on Lag BaOmer? And the third question is, what do Jews do on Lag BaOmer? As an entree into my first topic, it is my custom to begin with a joke following Talmudic practice. A story is told of a public speaker who's giving a speech, and a man gets up to leave in the middle. And the speaker says to him, "Where are you going?" And the guy says, "I'm going to get a haircut." And the speaker says, "Why didn't you get a haircut before my speech?" And the guy says, "When you started speaking, I didn't need a haircut." Now, I see a few guffaws in the audience. That's good. If you have good eyesight, you can see that number one, I need a haircut, and number two, I need a shave. And that, of course, is because it is customary not to get a haircut and not to shave, either between Pesach and Lag BaOmer, or between Rosh Chodesh Iyar and Shavuot, or between Pesach and Shavuot. There are all sorts of different customs as to exactly how long we mourn at this time of year. But the bottom line is that we mourn at this time of year. So my first question is why? And luckily I wrote a responsum about this, so I can share all of the sources with you in English. So I'm going to do share screen. Can you all see in front of you what's on the screen? Okay, good. So at the beginning, I posed the three questions. It's followed by the sources I'm going to teach in Hebrew, which I will refer to as I'm talking in English, and by my responsa, which appeared in my book, Response in a Moment, Volume 2. And all of these responses are also on the Schechter Institute website. If you write in Google my name and mourning or mourn between Pesach and Shavuot, you will find this responsum. This is the printed version, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. And the question was, it is customary not to get married and not to shave or cut one's hair between Pesach and Lag BaOmer, or Pesach and Shavuot. Why do we mourn during the period of Sfirat HaOmer? Is there any point in maintaining these mourning customs today? So the most common explanation of this period of mourning is what I'll call the Rabbi Akiva theory, which I'm sure many of you have heard. And it's based on a responsum by one of the Geonim, one of the rabbis of Babylon, between the years 500 and 1000 roughly. And we're not sure whether this responsum was written by Rav Natronai Gaon in the 9th century or Rav Hai Gaon at the beginning of the 11th century, but this is a direct translation of what he was asked and what he answered. And regarding your question, why don't we betroth or marry between Pesach and Atzeret? Atzeret is another name for Shavuot. Is it because of an actual prohibition or not? You'll notice that the questioner is not asking him whether we should mourn between Pesach and Shavuot. He's asking him why. In other words, there is already an existing custom in Babylon not to betroth or marry between Pesach and Shavuot, and he wants to know the reason why. And the Gaon answers, either Rav Natranai Gaon or Rav Hai Gaon, you should know that this does not stem from a prohibition, but from a mourning custom. For so said our sages, Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples, which is a rather strange way to say 24,000 students. We'll see that he got that expression directly from the Talmud. Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples, and they all died between Pesach and Atzeret because they didn't treat each other with respect. So I guess there's nothing new under the sun. Even then, students didn't treat each other with respect. And they further taught, and they all died a cruel death from diphtheria. So it says in the Talmud in Tractate Yevamot, which we'll see in a moment. And from that time forward, the Rishonim, i.e. the early sages, had the custom not to marry on these days, but he who jumps and marries, right? The Hebrew says, Umisha kafatz v'chanas, a person literally who jumps and marries. We do not punish him by punishment or lashes, but if he comes to ask before the fact, we do not instruct him to marry. And as for betrothal, he who wants to betroth between Pesach and Atzeret betroths because the main joy is the chuppah. In other words, at that period of time, there were two separate ceremonies. There was the betrothal ceremony, which we call kiddushin or erusin, and there was the marriage ceremony, which we call nisuin. Today, we do them at the same time under the chuppah. At that time, they were separate ceremonies. And he says you can betroth at this time of year, but you cannot get married at this time of year because that's the main festive event. As Rabbi David Feldman has pointed out, and I'll refer a number of times to his very important article published in the Proceedings of the Rabbinical Assembly, 1962, Rabbi David Feldman, of blessed memory, a real Talmid Chacham, who was rabbi in Teaneck, New Jersey for many decades. He says that the Gaon's opinion was quoted and accepted by many medieval codifiers, such as Rabbi Yitzchak Ibn Giyat, Rabbi Avram Ayarchi, Rabbi Tzidkiah of Italy, Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran of North Africa, and Rabbeinu Yerucham of Provence. Now, what was the Gaon referring to in his responsum? He was referring to a famous passage in the Babylonian Talmud. And this is what it says in the Talmud, in Yevamot. It was said that Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples, from Gabat to Antipatris. Those are the names of two places in Israel. And all of them died at the same time because they did not treat each other with respect. The world remained desolate until Rabbi Akiva came to our masters in the south and taught the Torah to them. And they were Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Judah, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. And it was they who revived the Torah at that time. A Tanah taught, a Tanah is one of the rabbis of the Mishnah. All of them died between Pesach and Shavuot. In other words, the first source did not say when they died. It just said that 12,000 pairs of disciples died. The second source says that this happened between Pesach and Shavuot. Rav Chama bar Abba, or maybe Rab Acha bar Abin, said all of them died a cruel death. And what was it? Rabbi Nachman replied, diphtheria. Now, quite a few modern scholars took this passage as a veiled reference to the Bar Kokhba revolt. As you probably know, the Bar Kokhba revolt took place between the years 132 and 135 of the Common Era. It was a terrible event. In the end, hundreds of thousands of Jews died or sold into slavery by the Romans. And Rabbi Akiva was an avid supporter of the Bar Kokhba revolt in a passage found in the Talmud Yerushalmi Tractate Ta'anit. And he considered Bar Kokhba the Messiah. So these modern scholars say that the 24,000 pupils who died are actually 24,000 Jewish soldiers who were killed by the Romans between Pesach and Shavuot, except on Lag BaOmer, which was a military victory. We'll get back to that in a moment. And this was the opinion of Rabbi Nachman Krochmal, Dr. Joseph Derenberg in the 19th century, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissenbaum in the beginning of the 20th century, and Professor Shmuel Safrai, Aaron Oppenheimer, and Chaim Licht towards the end of the 20th century. B'mchila kvodam, with all due respect, I find this theory to be extremely problematic. The entire theory about Rabbi Akiva. First of all, the numbers 12 and 12,000 are round numbers which occur innumerable times in rabbinic literature. They should not be taken literally. Number two, this story about the students of Rabbi Akiva appears in many other places, and in each place a different number of students is mentioned, 300, 40,000, 80,000. Most of the parallel passages do not mention that the tragedy occurred between Pesach and Shavuot at all. It simply says that his students died. The tone of the story is legendary. They did not treat each other with respect. And finally, the Talmud itself says nothing about mourning customs to commemorate this tragedy. In other words, even if you take this passage from the Talmud literally, that this tragedy happened between Pesach and Shavuot, the Talmud does not say that we are supposed to mourn for this tragedy. It simply tells a story. The first person to connect between the mourning and the story is Rab Natranai Gaon, some 750 years later. And indeed, my friend and former pupil, Dr. Aaron Amit of Bar-Ilan University, has recently shown in his article on the subject that the story itself has no historical basis. It was woven together from various legendary motifs in order to illustrate Rabbi Akiva's opinion that just as a person should teach disciples in his youth, he should continue to do so in old age. And it was the Babylonian Amoraim who added the motifs about Pesach and Shavuot and diphtheria. In other words, in the earlier sources in the passage, there is no mention of Pesach to Shavuot, and there is no mention of diphtheria. Those were added on later by the Babylonian Talmud. So, since many people were not satisfied with the Rabbi Akiva theory of mourning, they came up with many other theories. The second theory I call the Lemoralia theory. And if you've never heard of Lemoralia, don't feel badly. It's not exactly the most well-known event on the Roman calendar today. But in 1869, Dr. Julius Landsberger explained that the Jewish period of mourning from Pesach until Lag BaOmer was borrowed from the Romans. According to Ovid, a very famous Roman author, the Romans did not marry during the 31 days of May, which is called Lemoralia. Remember, 31 sounds a little bit familiar, not exactly 33, but 31. There are funeral rites honoring the souls of the departed, which return to wander over the earth, disturbing the peace of the living. The Lemoralia rites were held during the season, and no Roman maiden would risk her happiness by marrying in the month of May. And this superstition later migrated from Rome to France, Scotland, and Germany, and gave birth to popular expressions such as, if you marry in Lent, you will live to repent, marry in May, rue the day. And that, by the way, is why so many couples get married in June. This is left over from the Roman Empire. So if you got married in June, you now know why, because you're not allowed to get married in May, according to Roman, French, Scottish, and German folklore. So Landsberger, Julius Landsberger, in 1869, in an article in German, suggests that this is where we got the period of mourning at this time of year, that we borrowed it from the Romans. A medieval scholar, I'm now in theory number 3, they're numbered in Roman numerals, perhaps not by accident. Stam, I just use Roman numerals. The third theory is what I call the Gehenna theory. Now, those of you who know English and Hebrew know that the Gehenna is hell, or the underworld. And Rabbi Tzidkiah ben Avram Arofei was a famous rabbi in Italy in the 13th century, and his book is sitting on the shelf behind me, but I'm not going to pull it off the shelf because it's on the inside row of books. And he says in Shibolei Aleket in the 13th century, in the name of his brother Binyamin, and he's quoting Seder Olam Rabbah, which is a very ancient rabbinic work. Rabbi Akiva says there that the sentence of the wicked in Gehinom, in hell, is 12 months. And that, by the way, is why we recite Kaddish for 12 months or slightly less than 12 months. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that the sentence of the wicked in Gehinom is from Pesach until Shavuot. In other words, one of the rabbis of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, says that the normal sentence of the wicked in Gehenna, in hell, is between Pesach and Shavuot. Therefore, says Rabbi Tzidkiah, we mourn between Pesach and Shavuot for the wicked who are suffering in Gehinom. So that is the third explanation for this period of mourning. The fourth explanation is what modern scholars call the agricultural anxiety theory, which sounds like an Excedrin headache. The agricultural anxiety theory says that in the land of Israel, the farmers are very worried about their crops at this time of year. And it's true. The rainy season has ended. And remember, in those days, they didn't have the national water carrier of the state of Israel, and they didn't have desalination plants. And they didn't know whether their crops would succeed between Pesach and Shavuot. And you only find out by Shavuot time whether your crops have really succeeded, given the fact that the rain has already stopped and the crops begin to bloom and grow. So Rabbi David Abudraham, a famous Spanish Jewish scholar in the 14th century, says that we count the Omer from Pesach to Shavuot because the world is in pain. He uses the Hebrew word tsa'ar. Ha'olam b'tsar b'Pesach at Shavuot ala tvuot va'ala ilanot. The world is in pain from Pesach to Shavuot regarding the grains and the trees. And this explanation was repeated by Rabbi Yaakov Reischer in the 18th century. And indeed, there are many rabbinic sources, which I quote here, I'm not going to read them now. There are many rabbinic sources that say that the crops are judged between Pesach and Shavuot. In other words, we don't marry between Pesach and Shavuot, not because of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and not because of the Roman festival of Lemuralia, and not because the wicked are punished in Gehenna between Pesach and Shavuot, but because we are worried about crop failure between Pesach and Shavuot. That is the fourth theory. And as Professor Theodor Gaster summarizes it, the days or weeks preceding the harvest and opening of the cultural year are a time when the corporate life of the community is, so to speak, in eclipse. And finally, in my responsum, I explain the way that this custom was reinterpreted throughout Jewish history. And I begin here with a quote from Professor Salah Baron, the famous Jewish historian who taught at Columbia University for many decades. And he's referring to the way that the Sphira mourning was reinterpreted after the First Crusade in the year 1096. For those of you who don't know, in addition to trying to recapture Palestine from the Muslims, the Crusaders on their way to Palestine murdered many thousands of Jews in Germany. And this is what Salah Baron wrote. Since most of the massacres had taken place in the spring months of Iyar and Sivan, a heavy pall fell on the traditional period of Sfirat HaOmer. The entire 7-week interval was now reemphasized as a protracted period of national mourning. In other words, the rabbis in the year 1096 said that since the Jews of Germany were murdered by the Crusaders between Pesach and Shavuot, we are now mourning for them. So we see here a quote from Sefer Minhag Tov from Italy in the 13th century, quote, "The mourning is in honor of the pious and upright who sacrificed themselves in order to sanctify God's name," in other words, Kiddush Hashem, or the book called Sefer HaSufot in the 13th century, that people do not marry between Pesach and Atzeret. This is because of the pain of the decrees that the communities were killed in this entire kingdom. Similarly, if we jump forward a few more hundred years, after the Khmelnytsky massacres, which took place in the spring of 1648, and for those of you who don't know about this, this was another terrible period of Jewish history in Greater Poland. The Cossacks, who were actually rebelling against their landlords, in the process of rebelling against their landlords, they murdered between 50 and 200,000 Jews. And these are called the Khmelnytsky massacres. And again, this began in the spring. So after the Khmelnytsky massacres of 1648, the Sphira season was re-emphasized as a period of mourning. As Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote in his Sidur, I'll read the quote first in Hebrew. Uvavonotenu arabim kama kilot nechravu beoto haperek b'gzerot tatnu be'Ashkenaz uvishnat tafchet bePolania. He says that Rabbi Akiva's students died, and due to our many sins, a number of communities were destroyed at that same time of year during the Crusades in Ashkenaz and in 1648 in Poland. And finally, there is the Sphira season of 1943. As you may know, world Jewry learned about the Holocaust, what was going on in November of 42, when it was announced by Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss that 2 million Jews had already been murdered in Poland. By the spring of 1943, 3 million Jews had already been murdered in Poland. And 3 rabbinical students at JTS ran what they called the Sphira campaign. And those 3 students of blessed memory were my father, Rabbi Noah Golinkin, Rabbi Jerry Lipnick, and Rabbi Buddy Sachs. They were, of course, very young then. This is in the early 1940s. And they sent out packets of materials to 3,500 synagogues in the United States, and hundreds of synagogues and churches observed a period of mourning between Pesach and Shavuot of 1943 in order to mourn for the Jews who had already been killed by the Nazis, and to make noise so that the Roosevelt administration would do something about it and help the Jews leave Europe. So we see that the restrictions of the Sphira season were continuously reinterpreted. The Geonim took a group of already existing customs and said that they were mourning for Rabbi Akiva's students. The medieval halachic authorities took the period of mourning and said that it was to remember the massacres of the Crusades and the Khmelnytsky massacres. And many American Jews did the same thing in the spring of 1943 to mourn the Jews who had already been killed in Europe. And what I maintain, and I've been maintaining this since the 1970s, is that we should use this period of mourning, which has been on the Jewish calendar for at least 1,000 years, in order to remember the 6 million Jews who were killed during the Holocaust. In other words, we do not have to invent a new period of mourning. The period of mourning already exists. What we need to do is reinterpret this period of mourning as a way of remembering 1/3 of the Jewish people who were murdered by the Nazis. And as I conclude my responsum, by doing this, by remembering the 6 million during this period of year, we will achieve 2 objectives. Number 1, we will be following the footsteps of the men of the Great Assembly. The phrase used in the Talmud is Shehechziru atara liyoshna. They revitalized ancient customs that had fallen into disuse. In other words, we'll be revitalizing this period of mourning, but for a more relevant reason to our own lives. And number 2, we will be commemorating the Holocaust in a manner befitting the magnitude of the tragedy. Yom HaShoah will not be just a one-day event, but will become part of the Sphira season dedicated to mourning for the 6 million Jews. This is what I wrote in my responsum, and this is what I have been teaching for years on this specific subject. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free. I understand you can write in the chat. From my point of view, Max, if somebody wants to raise their hand and talk, that's also fine. Do any of you have any questions or comments about the period of mourning between Pesach and Shavuot?
There was just one question from Helene Simon asking, does Gehenna mean a rush of people like a crowd?
No, Gehenna is the name of a valley in Jerusalem, Ge Ben Hinnom, the valley of Ben Hinnom. And in the Bible, it was a place where the Canaanites used to sacrifice children to Molech. So it was not exactly a popular term in biblical Hebrew, Ge Ben Hinnom, the valley of Ben Hinnom. So at some point, the term was used to describe hell. Hell is hot, there are fires there. Perhaps it reminded them of the fires of Molech, I don't know. But by the rabbinic period, Ge Hinnom was already a synonym for the netherworld or hell, as opposed to Gan Eden or other more positive terms, the Garden of Eden, paradise, and so on and so forth. Other questions or comments?
No other questions at this point.
Okay, I see Rabbi Bob Rubin. Hello, Bob.
I just got another one.
Okay.
How about this tradition of bonfires on Lag BaOmer?
Okay, so we're going to get to the customs of Lag BaOmer in the second half of this talk. So if you recall, I started out with 3 questions. The first question is, why do we mourn between Pesach and Shavuot? And I gave you all the different explanations that have been offered, at least since the 9th century. And now we're going to shift over to our second question. And our second question is, why do we celebrate on Lag BaOmer? And before we get to the subject of what we do on Lag BaOmer, what in the world are we celebrating on Lag BaOmer? Lag BaOmer is a holiday on the Jewish calendar. If you open up your Women's League calendar, which I've been using for the past 45 years, if you open up your Women's League calendar, it says on this coming Thursday night and Friday, Lag BaOmer. It's a holiday. So my question is very simple. What in the world are we celebrating on Lag BaOmer? And my answer is very simple. Nobody knows. Okay, so I could just stop right there and we would turn off the computers, but I don't want to leave you in suspense. So therefore, I would like to try and answer the question, what in the world are we celebrating on Lag BaOmer? So now I will share screen with my second source sheet. And now this will be a little bit more difficult because these sources are mostly in Hebrew. Okay. Can you all see the source sheet on the screen? It says in the upper left-hand corner, part 2. Okay. Now I'm going to make this bigger. These sources are in Hebrew because on this I have not yet written a responsum. Okay. Lama chogagim b'Lag BaOmer? Why do we celebrate on Lag BaOmer? So I'm not going to teach you all the sources on this subject, but I'm going to teach you the most important sources on this subject. Everybody knows Lag BaOmer, so you probably assume that the holiday of Lag BaOmer is a very ancient holiday since all Jews celebrate it. If you assume that, you would be incorrect. The first mention of Lag BaOmer are the two sources on the screen in front of you. The one at the top of the page is from around the year 1300, and the one in larger print below it is from the year 1204. So let's begin with the year 1300. I Xeroxed this from the Meiri, Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri of Provence. Provence is southern France. There was a very important Jewish community in Provence, which unfortunately was exiled by the local non-Jews and authorities in the year 1306, which is why most Jews today don't even know there was a Jewish community in Provence. And one of the most famous rabbis in Provence was Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri. And because of the exile of the Jews of Provence, most of his volumes of commentary on the Talmud were only published in the 20th century. And I'm looking at his set of books on my shelf across the room. It literally takes up an entire shelf. In other words, he wrote a commentary on the entire Babylonian Talmud, which if you look at my hands, is about this wide. It takes up an entire shelf. It's a running commentary on the entire Babylonian Talmud. And when the Meiri gets to this passage in Yevamot that we studied a few minutes ago about Rabbi Akiva's 12,000 pairs of students, after he summarizes the story from the Talmud, this is what the Meiri says. The Kabbalah biyad Geonim, and it's a tradition in the hands of the Geonim. The Geonim are those rabbis from Babylon in the generations which preceded him, roughly the years 500 to 1000. Shebiyom Lag BaOmer Paska Hamita. That on the day of Lag BaOmer, the dying stopped. In other words, the students were dying between Pesach and Shavuot, but on that one day of the Omer, on the 33rd day of the Omer, none of the students died. That is the tradition. V'noagim mitoch kach shelo litanot bo, and therefore we do not fast on Lag BaOmer. V'chein noagim mitoch kach shelo lisa isha mipesach ad oto zman, and therefore we do not marry a woman from Pesach until Lag BaOmer, and presumably after Lag BaOmer it is permissible to get married. This is one of the first two mentions of the holiday of Lag BaOmer. You'll notice that he's not quoting a source. He says it's a tradition in the hands of the Geonim that the plague stopped on the 33rd day of the Omer, and therefore we do not fast on that day, and therefore beginning on that day, we can once again have wedding ceremonies. So this is the first mention of the holiday of Lag BaOmer, And he says it's because the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying on that specific day. We do not have that tradition in any Talmudic source. And now we look at the second early source, Rabbi Avram ben Natan Hayarchi. Those of you who know Hebrew know that the word Yareach means moon. Why was he called Hayarchi? Does anyone know? I can't see most of you because you're not on my screen. He was called Hayarchi because he lived in the town of Lunel. And Lunel in French is the moon. And therefore Lunel became Hayarchi, the moon guy. So Rabbi Avram ben Natan, the moon guy from Lunel, wrote his famous work. I'll hold it up for you so you'll see it. Oh, I forgot to hold up the Meiri, right? This is one volume of the Meiri, which is what I Xeroxed from a minute ago. And this is half of the book by Rabbi Avram Hayarchi, Sefer HaManhig, which he wrote, even though he was from Lunel, he migrated to Spain, and he wrote this book in Toledo in the year 1204. And it's a very important medieval halachic work. And this is what Rav Avram says in the year 1204. In the first paragraph, he says, Ve'ein minhag, it is not the custom lichnos ben Pesach le'atzeret, to get married between Pesach and Shavuot. Ve'lo mipnei she'isur yesh badavar, not because there's a prohibition, ela leminhag avelut, because it's a custom of mourning, al mashe rabo to perek, what happened at that time. And he summarizes the story of Rabbi Akiva's students. They didn't treat each other with respect, but you can perform a betrothal ceremony, but you're not supposed to perform a wedding ceremony. So in the first paragraph, he's basically summarizing what Rav Natronai Gaon said. The chidush, the innovation, is the second paragraph, starting on line 66. Ve'ach minhag b'Tzarfat u'b'Provancia, but it is the custom in Sarfat, which is northern France, and Provencia, which is Provence, southern France. Lichnos, and here there's a typo. The typo is not by Dr. Raphael, who edited this book. The typo is in this particular manuscript of the Sefer HaManhig. In all the other manuscripts, it says what I wrote here on the in between the lines. It says Milamed Gimel LaOmer. It is the custom in France and Provence to get married starting on Lag BaOmer, on the 33rd day of the Omer, and following. Vishamati b'shem Rabbeinu Rabbi Zrachya miGeronda. I heard in the name of Rabbi Zrachya of Gerona, who's a famous rabbi from the late 12th century. Shematza katuv b'sefer Yashan haba misfarad. He found in a manuscript, an old manuscript of the Talmud, which comes from Spain, Shemetu mi Pesach ve'ad prosa atzeret. In that manuscript of the Talmud, it doesn't say that Rabbi Akiva's students died from Pesach to Atzeret, from Pesach to Shavuot. It says they died from Pesach until pros Shavuot. I'll explain the word pros in a minute, because that's the problem. What does the word mean? In other words, they didn't die between Pesach and Shavuot. It says in that manuscript of the Talmud that they died between Pesach and pros Shavuot. Umay Pursa, what does the word Pursa mean? He says that Pursa means palga, half. As we have learned in another Talmudic source, that we talk about the laws of Passover 30 days before Passover. Upalga, and half of 30 is Chamisha Asar Yom, is 15 days, Kodem Atzeret, and therefore this is Lag BaOmer. For those of you who didn't understand a word of that, do not feel badly. I will now explain. What Rabbi Zrachya Levi is saying, maybe I'll take off the share for a minute. What Rabbi Zrachya Levi is saying is that the word pros means 15, and it says we mourn for Rabbi Akiva's students from Pesach until 15 days before Shavuot. Okay, so I'm not very good in math, but this much I know how to do. Take the 49 days of the Omer and subtract 15. What number do you arrive at? 34. Not 33, 34. Well, I'm not the first person who noticed this mistake in arithmetic. It was already pointed out by Rabbi Yoshua ibn Shuib in Spain in the 14th century. He says this explanation of Rabbi Zrachia doesn't make any sense. He's trying to explain Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. So he subtracts 15 from 49 and arrives at the 34th day of the Omer, which doesn't explain or solve our problem. The fact of the matter is, Rabbi Zrachia Levi was a very famous rabbi. And as it says in the Talmud, I do not reach his ankles in terms of Jewish knowledge. But unfortunately, he misunderstood the word pros. Professor Lieberman, my teacher, Professor Saul Lieberman, who was the most famous Talmudist in the 20th century, and I had the privilege of studying with him in 1980, the last year that he taught at JTS. Professor Saul Lieberman, in an article published in 1950, proves without a shadow of a doubt that the word pros Shavuot does not mean 15 days before Shavuot. It means Erev Shavuot, the eve of Shavuot, the day before Shavuot. In other words, that reading of the Talmud was not saying that Rabbi Akiva's students died between Passover and the 34th day of the Omer. It said that Rabbi Akiva's students died between Passover and Erev Shavuot and the day before Shavuot. So whether the reading is Erev Shavuot or the reading is Shavuot, it still does not explain why we are mourning on the 33rd day of the Omer. If there are some of you who didn't understand that, I can certainly sympathize. But this is a very famous explanation for Lag BaOmer, which has been refuted by Professor Lieberman and others. It in no way explains the fact that the 33rd day of the Omer is a holiday. If you have a question about this, please feel free to ask. You can write it in chat. I'm going to go back to the text. And now we arrive at the third famous source about Lag BaOmer, why the 33rd day of the Omer. And this source will show you that in Judaism, if you try hard enough, you can find an explanation for just about anything. Remember, our question is, why is the 33rd day of the Omer a holiday? It's not mentioned in the passage in the Talmud or any other ancient passage. It's first mentioned in the 13th century. So along comes the Maharil, Rabbi Yaakov Molin. If any of you know a Jew named Molin, chances are they are somehow related to Rabbi Yaakov Molin. He died in 1427 in Germany. And his book of customs, Minagei Maharil, is a very, very famous halachic work. And this is what he says about Lag BaOmer. I'm going to translate it straight into English. Lag BaOmer is always on the 18th day of Iyar. And in Shachari, we do not recite Tachanun. That's the first line. Middle of the second line. Said Mahari Segal, said Rabbi Yaakov Molin. Even though it says in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that the students of Rabbi Akiva died between Pesach and Shavuot, even so, on the 33rd day of the Omer, we make a simcha, we make a joyful day. Because they only died on the days on which we recite Tachanun during these 7 weeks of the Omer. But on every day that we don't recite Tachanun, meaning that it's a holiday, they did not die. And if we subtract those days from the days of the Sfirat HaOmer, which means subtract the 7 days of Pesach, the 3 days of Rosh Chodesh, which is Rosh Chodesh Iyar and Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and the 7 Sabbaths which occur at that time of year, you end up with 32 days. Nimtza de lo metu rak lamed bet yamim. It turns out that they only died for 32 days. And that is, Rabbi Yaakov Molin is inventing here an explanation and saying that they did not die on the days which are festive days, such as Pesach or Rosh Chodesh. If we subtract those festive days from the 49 days of the Omer, we end up with 32 days on which the students of Rabbi Akiva died. Therefore, when we finish the 32 days on which altogether the students of Rabbi Akiva died, the next day is a festival, the 33rd day of the Omer, and that is why we are happy on the 33rd day of the Omer. Now, this is a brilliant explanation, which of course has no basis in reality, which is that you count up the days on which the students died, 32 days, and we artificially made the 33rd day a holiday, even though actually nothing happened on that 33rd day of the Omer. Again, if you did not understand the logic, I certainly sympathize, but this is Rabbi Yaakov Bolden's explanation for Lag BaOmer at the beginning of the 15th century. And then, of course, we get to the modern theories, and they were nicely summarized by Rabbi David Feldman. I'm looking for his article. Where is it? In his article in the Encyclopedia Judaica, the article is called Omer. In the Encyclopedia Judaica, published in 1970, Rabbi Feldman summarized that article I mentioned before, which was written in 1962. And this is not in front of you on the screen. And Rabbi Feldman summarizes some of the modern scholarly theories. So, for example, our friend Rabbi Julius Landsberger, he said, he said that we had the days of Lemuralia, the 31 or 32 days of May, 31 days of May and the last day of April, that's 32. And therefore the 33rd day was Lag BaOmer, the day on which you once again are allowed to get married, hence Lag BaOmer, which we copied from the Romans. That's typical of the modern explanations. And the other modern explanation, which we already mentioned, is that the modern scholars invented this idea that the Bar Kokhba revolt, the soldiers were dying between Pesach and Shavuot, but on one day they did not die, which is Lag BaOmer, and that's why we are happy. Of course, the only problem is that there's no text which tells us this story that they invented. And finally, you have the explanation in front of you in source number 4, which I Xeroxed from Rabbi Feldman's article from 1962. And this has to do with the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, and his student, Rabbi Chaim Vital. As you may know, one of the most famous Kabbalists of all time was Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who's called the Ari. And he died at a very young age. I think he was 36 when he died, around the year 1573. And Rabbi Yitzchak Luria was made famous by his Boswell, by his student, Rabbi Chaim Vital. And this is what Rabbi Chaim Vital wrote in the early 1600s or the late 1500s. He talks about the tradition of going to the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai on Lag BaOmer. And he says that his teacher, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, used to do that. And I underline the next sentence. V'hatam, and the reason is, Shemet Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai b'yom lamed gimel ba'omer. The reason is that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died on the 33rd day of the Omer. So you may ask, if Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died on Lag BaOmer, why are we so happy? And the answer is that it says in the Zohar, which is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says to his disciples, on my yortzeit, you should rejoice. So Rabbi Yitzchak Luria and Rabbi Chaim Vital tell us that Lag BaOmer is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's yortzeit. And the reason we are rejoicing is because it is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's yortzeit. The only problem with this explanation from around the year 1600 is that it appears around 300 years after the holiday of Lag BaOmer is first mentioned. So this is what's called ex post facto, that after the fact, the Kabbalists of Safed decided that Lag BaOmer is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's yortzeit, and that is why we are celebrating on Lag BaOmer. And this is stated once again by another Kabbalistic work, Chemdat Yamim. We don't know who wrote it. It was first published in 1731. And Chemdat Yamim says, and this is again from Rabbi Feldman's article, V'nimtza katuv b'sefer HaKadmonim, it's written in an ancient book, Sheilo Yom Lag BaOmer hu Yoma D'itpata Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that the day of Lag BaOmer is the day on which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died, a blessed memory, min alma, from this world, and therefore we study the secrets of the Zohar on that day, and we are happy in the Hilula, in the rejoicing, in memory of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So we see here all of these different explanations for Lag BaOmer. The Meiri says that Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying on that day. Rabbi Zrachia Halevi did his complicated calculation of 15 days before Shavuot, which doesn't work. The Maharil did his complicated calculation to arrive at the number 33. And the modern theory says that it's the day when Bar Kochba's soldiers stopped dying in the revolt against the Romans. And Rabbi Yitzchak Luria and Rabbi Chaim Vital tell us that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died on Lag BaOmer. So in answer to my question, what exactly happened on Lag BaOmer, the answer, as Rabbi Feldman pointed out, is we have absolutely no idea. We just know that Jews have been celebrating on Lag BaOmer since at least the year 1300. Are there any questions or comments about this section of my talk?
Yeah, we've got a few questions.
Okay.
So Stephen Chopnik says, but we do not recite Tachanun for all of Nisan, so there would be 15 days of Nisan, not just 7 days of Pesach, so how do you get to 32?
That is a good question. Apparently, the Maharil did not apparently, in the passage that we looked at, he did not quote the tradition of not reciting Tachanun during Nisan. In other words, he did the calculation of the 7 days of Pesach, the days of Rosh Chodesh, etc., etc. He came up with those days, and that's how he arrived at the number of days when we don't recite Tachanun, the number of days we do recite Tachanun, and that's how he did his arithmetic.
And MJ Lopatin.
I didn't say it was convincing. I just explained what he said.
MJ Lopatin asks, how do you feel about the Karaite interpretation that the Omer should start on the Shabbat after Pesach, which affect the timing of both Lag BaOmer and Shavuot?
Well, needless to say, I'm not a Karaite, and nor am I a Sadducee. It was the Sadducees already 2,000 years ago who interpreted the verse Mimocharat HaShabbat, from the day after Shabbat, that they started counting down to Shavuot from the day after Shabbat and not from the second day of Pesach, which of course meant that they ended up with Shavuot on a different date. I'm not 100% sure that the Karaites followed that, but the Sadducees definitely followed that. And that was one of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We are Pharisaic Jews. In other words, the rabbis of the Talmud follow the Prushim, follow the Pharisees, and we are a continuation of that rabbinic tradition. So our understanding of the verse Mimocharat HaShabbat, that you will wave the Omer the day after the Sabbath, is not the day after the Sabbath, but the day after the first Yom Tov of Pesach, which is why we celebrate Shavuot when we do.
And we got one more. We have one more. Since the exact days of mourning differ between different communities, couldn't the mourning be considered minhag and not necessarily binding for all?
The mourning is definitely minhag, as Rav Natranai Gaon explicitly stated. He says it's not a halacha, it's a minhag. It's a minhag that's been observed for at least 1,100 years. If you open up the Shulchan Aruch, which I did not Xerox here, Orach Chaim Taf Tzadik Gimel, paragraph 493, you will see there that there are different customs as to when exactly you mourn, whether it's from Pesach until Lag BaOmer, from Rosh Chodesh Iyar until Shavuot, or from Pesach until Shavuot. And those three customs have to do with the various opinions of the medieval authorities, and we only quoted a small number of the medieval authorities. So if you're interested in the three different traditions as to when you mourn, when exactly, you should open up the Shulchan Aruch to paragraph 493, and you will see there the different traditions of mourning between Pesach and Shavuot. So in my responsum, I was not advocating whether you should follow one of those three customs. I was advocating that in general, we should follow the custom of mourning between Pesach and Shavuot. Okay, the last part of my talk has to do with, I'm having a problem with my battery here in my computer. I don't know why. Well, I hope the current doesn't run out before we finish. The last part of my talk has to do with what we actually do on Lag BaOmer. And the next sources all talk about the customs on Lag BaOmer. And as you will see, most of them center around the town of Meron in the Galilee. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's high up in the mountains near Safed, and it's a very beautiful location. And this is where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is buried according to tradition. There's a beautiful tomb there. And all of these customs started out there. So the first source, I'll make this a little bit smaller. The first source is again a report from Rabbi Chaim Vital. And he says that on Lag BaOmer, we go to the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar. They're buried together. And of course, it makes sense. The Kabbalists of Safed thought that this was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's yahrzeit that they are celebrating. They went to visit his grave. And this year, there's a big controversy because of Corona. How many people are they going to allow on Mount Meron? Last year, during COVID, no one was allowed on Mount Meron. I think 100 people were allowed there. In a normal year, there are 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 people on Mount Meron on Lag BaOmer. And he goes on to say that one of the things that Rabbi Yitzchak Luria did on Mount Meron on Lag BaOmer, and I underlined this sentence, he took his small son there, and there he gave him a haircut according to the well-known custom, and he made a big festival. This is the origin of the custom of giving boys a haircut on their around their third birthday on Lag BaOmer. You know that this is a very popular custom among Hasidim until today. In Yiddish, it's called Opsheren, and the Opsheren is done either on the third birthday or on Lag BaOmer. And I must confess, I've never been to Meron on Lag BaOmer, but I've seen movies. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of little boys having their hair cut on Lag BaOmer on Mount Meron. This is a direct result of the passage that we just read, written by Rabbi Chaim Vital some 400 years ago. There are all sorts of other descriptions about what went on Mount Meron. This passage is from Chaim Yosef David Azulai, the Chida, in the 18th century. He says Yom Lag BaOmer is a big festival, the Hilula, the festival of his yahrzeit, and we know that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wanted us to rejoice. And some people study on Lag BaOmer, and they study stories about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and they study the Zohar, and this is a beautiful custom. Then we have a testimony here from Rabbi Yosef Sofer in the year 1765, and he says that at 3 times a year, people go to the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the month of Elul, in the month of Nisan, and the 3rd time on Lag BaOmer, and this is called the Hilula, the celebration of the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And we have to rejoice and make big festivals and tupim umecholot with, and we have to have drums and dancing, and so on. In the 3rd explanation, also from the 1760s. We now arrive at another custom which you may not have heard of, which is rather strange, but was a very common custom. And this is, I'm Xeroxed another book here on Jewish customs. And this is called the Hadlaka, the lighting of the flames. And this, by the way, is where we got our medurot, our bonfires on Lag BaOmer. They would go up on the roof of the Beit Midrash at Meron, and there was a big bowl there with oil. And everybody would throw into the bowl various items of clothing made out of silk and scarves and hats and jewelry and even gold and silver coins. And then they would light the bowl of oil in the 3rd hour of the night. And it was all set afire, and you could see it from afar. And this was the holiday of lighting the torch, so to speak, on Mount Meron on Lag BaOmer. And he goes on to say that they would study the Zohar that night. And in the morning, they would have tefillot, they would have davening in the synagogue. And then they would make hakafot. They would do like we do on Simchat Torah in the Beit Midrash. So we see here, in addition to the custom of cutting the hair of children, the custom at Meron was to light a huge bonfire in which they would burn all sorts of things, including clothing, which is very odd. And this was a custom for hundreds of years at Mount Meron. Not surprisingly, there were many rabbis who were opposed to the burning of clothing on Lag BaOmer, and that's the next sheet here, which I took from Rabbi Zevin's book, HaMoadim Ba'alacha, and he describes the opposition of rabbis to this custom. For example, in the middle of the 19th century, Rabbi Yosef Shalom Nathanson of Lemberg, which today is called Lvov in Ukraine, he says he doesn't understand this custom of burning clothing on Mount Meron. This is a prohibition of Baal Tashchis, of Baal Tashchit, of unnecessarily destroying property, and it's obviously forbidden by Jewish law. Finally, we have the custom of bows and arrows on Lag BaOmer. Let me see if I can turn this around. No. Maybe you can tell me what happened. I don't know what happened, Max, to my text. I tried to turn it around and it disappeared.
That was the refresh button.
So if I refresh, will it go back?
Doesn't look like it. You might have to open it again.
All right. Well, I don't think I have time to do that, so I'll just tell you what it says. I finally got to a text in English, and then I can't see it. So let me take it off the screen. That was a Xerox from Theodore Gaster's book, The Festivals of the Jewish Year. And Gaster is trying to explain the custom of bows and arrows on Lag BaOmer. How many of you grew up with bows and arrows on Lag BaOmer, or at least know that such a custom exists? Okay. I have no idea where this custom comes from. I have not investigated it myself. I will simply share with you Professor Gaster's theory, which I do not find convincing at all. Professor Gaster brings the custom of bows and arrows on Lag BaOmer, and this is what he writes. You have to understand that Professor Gaster loved explanations in which one people borrows from another people. The true explanation lies, however, in the common practice of shooting arrows at demons and evil spirits on the days when the evil spirits are believed to be rampant. May Day is preeminently one of these occasions, for according to popular tradition, the preceding night, which is called Walpurgis Night, is the time of the witches' Sabbath. In Germany, it is common usage for country folk to go into the woods on May morning and shoot arrows. Anyone who hears the noise from a distance is expected to say, "Shoot my witch away." In other words, he says that on Lag BaOmer, we are not shooting bows and arrows at the Roman soldiers, we are shooting bows and arrows at the evil spirits, and we borrowed this custom from our German neighbors in Europe. Is this true? I have absolutely no idea. I do not know when the custom of bows and arrows began. It is already widely mentioned in the 19th century. It will require further investigation to find out who originally mentions the custom of bows and arrows on Lag BaOmer, but it was a very widespread practice in Eastern Europe on Lag BaOmer. And I would like to conclude with a little bit of music, if this technology works. And unfortunately, I can't show you the words because that's what I lost on the screen. There's a very famous piyut or poem which Sephardic Jews sing on Lag BaOmer, which is called Bar Yochai Nimshachta Ashrecha. And it was written by Rabbi Shimon Lavi, one of the disciples of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria in the late 16th century. I'm going to play for you one of the most popular tunes for this poem. Okay, I see it keeps going. If you go into any Sephardic synagogue in Israel, either the Shabbat before Lag BaOmer, the Shabbat after Lag BaOmer, on Lag BaOmer, you will hear them singing this poem with this specific tune. There are many other tunes to this poem, but this is one of the piyutim, one of the poems composed in honor of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which Sephardic and Hasidic Jews sing on Lag BaOmer. So in conclusion, we have seen various explanations as to why we mourn between Pesach and Shavuot, and my advocacy that we should continue to mourn for the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. We have seen the various explanations for Lag BaOmer, none of which are particularly convincing, and we have seen some of the customs of Lag BaOmer, including the bonfires, the cutting of hair, the singing of piyutim, and the shooting of bows and arrows. If there are any other questions, Max, please feel free.
There was just a couple of questions of what's the actual name of that piyut?
It's called, believe it or not, it's called Bar Yochai. But if you write in Google, Bar Yochai Nimshachta Ashrecha, right? Nimshachta means you have oil anointed on you. You have been anointed, therefore you are happy. Shemen Sason Mechaverecha. Your joyful oil from among your friends. And as in most piyutim, as in most poems, it spells out the name of the author. His name was Shimon Lavi, and it's spelled out in the first letter of each of the verses. So that is a very famous piyut for Lag BaOmer that you can find on YouTube without any problem.
And then there was just one more question going back to the first part of the talk. This is from Rabbi Ben Herman, who was asking, Nisan is traditionally a joyous month. Is that to be reinterpreted as well?
Well, that's what's so odd. You would think that Nisan is a joyous month, but not necessarily. One of the things I showed in my articles about Yom HaShoah is that even though Nisan was a joyous month, first of all, we have the period of mourning since the 9th century, which started at Pesach. And number two, in the medieval period, there were 4 public fast days which were decreed during the month of Nisan. In other words, for specific tragedies that happened to Jewish communities at that period of time. And interestingly enough, when the Knesset decided that Yom HaShoah would fall on the 27th day of Nisan, which is usually considered a period of joy, the person who proposed that law in the Knesset in 1951, his name was Rabbi Mordechai Nurak. And Rabbi Mordechai Nurak was one of the leaders of the Mafdal party, the National Religious Zionist Party. So Rabbi Mordechai Nurak said that I am proposing that the 27th of Nisan be the day of Holocaust memory because the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on the 19th of April on Erev Pesach, and it was going on at this time of year. In other words, even though he knew that Nisan is usually a joyous period of time, he proposed the 27th of Nisan as Yom HaShoah. That was accepted by the Knesset, and that is Holocaust Memorial Day until today.
Thank you so much for teaching today. Really an excellent class. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope that you will join us next week for our final class in this series. That class will be on Yom Yerushalayim. The title will be Jerusalem Built Up, a City Knit Together. How does Jerusalem unite the Jewish people? Taught by Rabbi Chaya Rowan Baker, who is a lecturer at the Schechter Rabbinical Seminary. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Toda rabah.